corporate America or corporations are still rather stuck in that capitalistic patriarchal place and ableist place and probably other things too, that isms and ists. But when I go in to talk about neurodiversity affirming practices and attitudes in the workplace, right away I'm talking about intersectionality. Like, let's look at all the identities, the whole person. I'm not going to get caught up in labeling. And I don't think it's useful to label, oh, this person's this person's that, because then you're seeing them only through that filter.
Hey, everybody, welcome to Finding the Upside. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today in the studio, I have a very special guest. Her name is Pasha Marlowe, and I want to give a brief introduction of who she is, and then we're going to turn it over to her. First, let me welcome you. Hi, Pasha. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Maria. Happy to be here.
Great. So Pasha is a marriage and family therapist, but she's now working as a neurodiversity coach, and that came after her own healing journey, where she made her own discoveries and started to reframe some of the social models and diagnostic labels that define us. Pasha coaches people to understand and accept that, like gender and sexuality, we have neurological differences that also put us on a spectrum. And she's going to share a little bit more about some of the terminology and some of the things that we need to kind of reframe and redefine, things that you'll hear and things that people talk about. But I'm going to turn it over to her to have her share what she does and a little bit more about her work and give us just a little bit more of an expanded on you.
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I love coaching. I used to work as a therapist and now I work as a coach because I feel like it offers me a little bit more flexibility to lead with vulnerability and to think outside the box and to do some maybe untraditional things for and with my clients, because a lot of times my coaching uh looks like practical skills and life skills. Sometimes we're cleaning out closets and moving through grief together, and sometimes we're out on a walk holding somebody accountable for movement. And sometimes we're doing therapeutic comedy. And I feel like the broad scope of it allows me to work with all kinds of neurodivergent minds, which is really fun.
That's awesome. So, I before we get a little deeper into discussion on the topics, I would love it if you could define some terms for us. Um, you before we get just more into discussion about them, you utilize the terms neurodiverse, neurodivergent, and neuroqueer. Could you give us a definition on each of those so we have a better understanding of what that means?
Yeah. A lot of times people use neurodiverse in place of neurodivergent, possibly because it sounds better, or possibly it's just what they learned. But we're all neurodiverse as a human species. Just like there's a diversity of races and colors and flowers and, trees, there's a diversity of humans and neurotypes. So neurodiversity is really the entire human species is neurodiverse. All teams are neurodiverse, all groups are neurodiverse. However, neurodivergent is when somebody's way of thinking or moving, living, and loving diverges from the dominant norm. And that's when we move into things talking about neuronormativity. Like, what is society's idea of what a normal brain is or a normal way of thinking and learning is? And that's neurodivergent. Neuroqueer is a really fun, beyond the intersection of neurodiversity and queerness, a way of queering and questioning and diverting from all norms, including social norms and gender norms and neuronormativity and heteronormativity. It's just like, who made up these rules, and do I believe them, and why am I following them, and what do I really believe, and queering that and challenging some of those standards that have been around just because at one point somebody created them isn't necessarily meaning that they're true or integrous with ourselves and our thoughts.
Yeah, and I would imagine that in your work with others, part of what comes up in the work is sometimes the struggles with sitting outside of those norms, right? And making people feel like they are not quote unquote normal. And
Hmm.
that's really just the societal labels or the just definitions that we've been given, which I think we're at a time, I don't know if you agree with me, where we're really questioning all of it.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yes.
what I'd love to understand a little bit more, because I think people who be maybe listening may have heard some of these groups that this might impact, but with neurodiversity and like the way people learn, could you elaborate a little bit more about that and why that's so important to understand for us as a society as a whole?
Sure. So the neurodivergent umbrella, if you will, incorporates or encapsulates, however you want to say it, beyond ADHD and autism, which is kind of the common narrative, like, oh, we're just talking about people with ADHD and autism. But you can also put in dyslexia and mental health issues, and I believe trauma, and also traumatic brain injury and epilepsy, and even a lifetime practice of meditation, like anything that diverges us from the dominant normal way of thinking, quote unquote normal. And so that's a lot of people. I mean, trauma alone, like I'm just going to say that's all women or female identified humans, right? And anyone who's marginalized. So now we're really talking about understanding and supporting and accommodating an enormous amount of people who have been lacking in that support and are not thriving in at work and at home because of the lack of support. And so right now there's a really wonderful trend for companies to mindfully hire neurodivergent individuals, and that's fantastic. And they also need to keep them and promote them, by the way. And so that's part of my work is offering neurodiversity affirming practices and attitudes into the workplace, but also at home, because I think a lot of times we can feel more aligned at work and more successful at work and more energized at work. And then at home, we often struggle. So that's where I blend my marriage and family therapy experience with the neurodivergent coaching.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And one of the things that I have always, as I've spent many, many years in leadership in a corporate environment and also in my own business. But that's one of the things that I've always embraced is, we don't want the same, right? We don't
Mhm.
want the same. All of the diversity, not just in all the things that are always been talked about, but in terms of the brain and how people think and how people look at things and how people process, and just different types of brains offer all different kinds of unique and innovative ways of solving problems and bringing things to discussion that really help not only the team but the company themselves, and if we're talking about business. But if we look at that and expand that to society, we need that too.
Absolutely. Like we're
We
not
need
going to
that too.
we can't fix our problems with the same tools we've been using, right?
No.
And so allowing people to lead who think differently, call it think outside the box or
Mhm,
creatively,
mhm,
or see patterns differently,
mhm.
patterns of objects or human behavior. Either it's really useful to our society to progress and expand. Absolutely.
Agreed. Agreed. So, I'd love to hear, working as a neurodiversity coach, then, what are some of the common challenges that neurodivergent individuals face when navigating societal expectations or norms? What are some examples of that?
I think every day there's a struggle with shame, self doubt, and imposter syndrome when we compare ourselves to societal norms or neurotypical norms, and we don't honor our own abilities or capacity. Because sometimes we can do a lot of things, but our energy levels or our chronic illness or our life circumstances don't allow, or it doesn't feel integrated and aligned. So knowing what our abilities and our capacities are, not comparing ourselves to other people's, I call it front stage, because if we compare ourselves to everything that happens in front of the curtain, that's not true or complete. And so realizing that we're not alone in struggling, and that it is very, I won't say normal, but common to wake up as if we've just returned to our original software and felt, confused and out of place, and we don't fit in, and we're alien, and we're having ruminating thoughts and intrusive thoughts, and we're feeling shame and imposter syndrome and doubt. And if we know that that is common to start the day that way, and that we build up from there with mindfulness or journaling or walking or connection or whatever tools you use, then we're going to release some of the shame of expectations of like, why is life so hard for me? Why have I not figured out how to adult or survive the day or thrive through the day?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I know, I've had my own experience. My son has been diagnosed with ADHD, and what you just said, there's many times that he's expressed that. Why is everything so hard? And
Yes.
I think that people can feel very alone when they don't have that support or um, that environment, that safe space that embraces all of that. And I think it's I'd be curious. I know I have a bunch of questions I want to ask you about, bringing this into companies and things companies can do to change some of the work environment and culture to support this. But um, I'm interested to know if you think we've made progress there yet as a society,
In companies or in the stigma
and the
around.
stigma
Yeah,
around.
I think so. And actually, in the last 3 to 5 years, I've seen a lot of that stigma released. There's an interesting phenomenon over the last few years, thanks to a combination of finally research on girls and women and how that looks a lot different. That often girls and women are misdiagnosed and underdiagnosed. How it manifests in women is different. Research is coming out on that. The pandemic was an opportunity for some of us to all of a sudden come face to face with, oh, I have no structure. This is what happens. Oh, I'm working from home. This is what happens. Oh, my children are struggling and now they're 504s or IEPs. My goodness, that symptom list and trait list looks a lot like mine. Oh, maybe I'm neurodivergent too. There's that. And then, frankly, things like TikTok and social media just becoming a lot more visible about the experience, the lived experience of people with neurodivergent minds going on and saying, like, this is what it feels like every day. Those lived experiences have really translated into a sense of, I believe, belonging and less stigmatizing across the board. We have a long way to go still, but I really have felt a shift in the last few years. Yeah.
Well, that's really inspiring, and I feel a lot of hope with that because I know with my own experience just with my son, even in the education system, what that lack of that did to him. And I talk to a
Yes.
lot of parents who have that, and we're talking about a teen, but I think it's because it helps to shape and it's relatable for a lot of people of what that looks like. I think in my generation, and maybe even in yours, there was no talk of ADHD. Like, who knows? I
Mhm.
may be and not be diagnosed. There may be many of us like that. Um, but like what you said about the pandemic, like, oh, I have no structure. Now look what happens. Like, and not understanding that until it happens, then you kind of see what that looks like and see what that experience is. But um, I am an advocate and always, of course, advocated for my own child, but all children and adults that are put in a space that makes them feel like what they're doing isn't good just because it's different.
Exactly. And just thinking about your son at school or anyone who's listening, their children at school, let's say people with ADHD or autism specifically right now, just for ease of the conversation, have a lot of excess energy, could be internalized hyperactivity, internal, like ruminating thoughts, intrusive thoughts, spinning thoughts, or excess energy physically. So sitting still is not accommodating to a person or a child with that excess energy. And so the fact that we ask the kids to sit still without, whether it's, obviously everyone in school can't have a walking treadmill, but like a ball or fidget spinners or things like that's one way to accommodate. But then there's also the narrative out there of like, Well, if you just do this for 21 or 30 days, you can create a habit. You can create a habit of bringing your pencil to school, of remembering to do your homework. That's not necessarily true for someone who struggles with executive functioning. I sometimes say I have zero habits because if the definition of a habit is to do things over and over until it becomes involuntary without thought, I have zero habits. It's always a process. It's always decision making, thinking through consequences, thinking through all the dynamics of something. So if we know that we don't create habits and build habits like a neurotypical person would, then we could release ourselves from some of the shame and expectations around it. And if we could start to educate people on how different it is for a neurodivergent person, then we'll hopefully, come to more understanding on the whole. But there's some systems, unfortunately, like the education system, that's still, you know, maybe stuck in its older ways of thinking through things. And as younger people come into leadership, hopefully that will change.
That's true. That's very true, and there's a lot of hope for that. Um, I was thinking about asking this question later on, but I really love to get your take. I mean, one of the things that for me, that I've observed, and it's kind of this almost like different perspectives in our society right now. There's a lot of um I don't, I guess I'll say it that way, like poo-pooing of like DE&I and like inclusivity and that it's bad and all of these things. And I still think that we have enough voices, and as trends change and we evolve and grow, and as you said, the newer generations who have a better understanding and have been more exposed more to more information of what this looks like and acceptance and all of that, how do you think we're going to, in the next, say, 10 years, navigate that? Because there is a real contingent that is trying to squash a lot of these efforts. And I'm curious what you think about that and how we continue to do the work to really make things change.
Yeah. I think the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work is still so necessary, and there's still a lot more to be done. When I talk to companies, the people who come to the webinars or the coaching groups who are part of the DEI part of the organization, or they have the ERG, like separate groups, depending on their different intersectionality. It's life saving. Like they say that having these groups and smaller communities and connections like allows them to feel like they belong at work, keeps them at work, which keeps them able to afford their home and live. And so it really trickles down. And I feel like the sense of belonging is, I'd like to hope, like never going to be something that we don't focus on. I feel like people leave their jobs because of the lack of psychological safety as much as anything. And that psychological safety just won't be there if there's not that awareness of intersectionality and diversity inclusion. And so I feel like there's so much further to go. And I feel like, without getting political too much, but I mean, there's a push, like you said, um, you know, away from like, why are we focusing all of our needs on this small population? There's sometimes part of the narrative, and I don't agree with it, but I just think, we can't, one person can't be free unless we're all free, one person can't be liberated unless we're all liberated. And I like to think that in 10 years what we're moving towards is not so much like, how do you accommodate an ADHD brain, how do you accommodate an autistic brain? It'll be like, how do we accommodate all brains, like neurotypicals and neurodivergence? Like, we're all uniquely nuanced because of our own filter, our own intersectionality, our own traumas. Like, let's just, in a universal design kind of way, how can we be open to collaborating with everybody?
And our all commonality is we are all different, but we're all human, and
Yeah.
focusing on that and that's the interesting thing. Again, like I certainly don't want to make political commentary at all either, but it would be, this conversation can't happen without acknowledging that, and I think that's important because it's always been my work, and I'm sure yours as well, is to continue to have these conversations, bring this enlightenment, have people understand what it's good to have this and the impact of not having it, right?
Yeah.
And I also think from a business perspective, we hear a lot of narratives about having difficulty finding people to work. And I don't necessarily totally subscribe to that. But if that's someone's reality in a company, you have to think about if people leave because there isn't that safe space, they're not going to want to come to work for a place where there
Mhm.
isn't that safe space. So you're already challenged with all the other things that the business world needs to do to make sure they're incentivizing people the right way and paying them fairly and all of those things. Also, about the culture has to be right because
Absolutely.
people have the choice to say no.
Absolutely. And I think the company culture is defined by the actions and inactions and not the policies. So there could be a policy, DEIB, we're so inclusive. And then you get there and they're not. And so, yeah, it's and that discrepancy makes somebody feel very unsafe.
And
Hmm.
and I'm going to say this because you and I, when we first spoke, I think I shared this with you, but it's one of the things that really makes my the hairs on my arm stand up and like really me get angry inside. I've done training for years and we've done, diversity training, but it's a lot of companies, especially in the past, and probably, like you said, hopefully, if they're going to really have the D&I, that they really live it. It's not just the check the box, because so many companies have done that in the past, and they would
Yep.
call me to do a training because something happened where
Yes.
someone complained. And,
Yeah.
like, you're missing the point there. The point is that brings up a gap of something you haven't addressed and lived. It's not, "Let's do a training and we're done."
No.
It's you're really embracing that. You're it and what you said, it's not just words, it's actions. What does this action and the way we operate here, the way that people interact with one another, what's the accepted way and expected way that
Right.
sits inside that is so
Yes.
important to understand. um
I was just speaking with a group from a tech company out in California just before this call, and one of the things that kept coming up is communication styles. And a lot of people who are neurodivergent, more specifically maybe autistic, are very straightforward, very blunt, very ethical, very just tell it like it is, which isn't very flowery, isn't always well received, isn't bookended with compliments like we were taught long ago. Compliment, feedback, compliment. Like that's not the way they think. They clear is kind and they want to give and receive feedback this way. Somebody else, maybe somebody with ADHD who's prone to rejection sensitivity, needs a little bit of complimenting and praise in there. And if the supervisor or manager isn't aware of these sensitivities, it's just going to be harder to communicate with their employees, but also with each other, just collaboratively. So having an open, honest conversation about how do you ask for help? How do you give feedback? How do you like to receive feedback? Like even just that I find isn't done very often. And then they're really stuck feeling like, "Oh no, now I offended them. Now I made them mad. Now they think poorly of me or they think I'm something I'm not." And then their integrity is at question. And that often spirals them out into a place where they feel like they don't feel safe and don't aren't seen and heard at work, and then they quit.
yeah,
Mhm.
it's the exactly as you described it. It's so accurate. And I think also what's important to understand is that, just communication in general, as you said, we all communicate differently in it, and it's because of all the things you discussed, but it's also, if people aren't thinking about this, think about even just what the analogy is we are all from the US, but we communicate differently depending upon where we grew up and where
Yeah.
we live.
Mhm.
Like, I had a colleague that said to me at one time, he was in the South, and I said something on a call to him, and I was pretty direct. And I don't want to put people in a box where they don't want to belong, but typically people from the Northeast are a little more direct than people from the South. And he said, "Oh, I just love you people from the Northeast. You just tell it like it is. And down here, we're all bless your heart and stabbing each other in the back." And I was like, well, that was funny. It really is true. That encapsulate people from different parts of the country, even communicate differently, and respecting that and understanding that. So, if we expand that to what you just said, all the different brains, all of the different ways of being, you really need to, it's a skill to navigate that, to be able to communicate effectively, so that there isn't conflict, so that there isn't all this disconnection and destroying trust and respect and all of those things that go along with that.
Yeah, it's so true. And not only are there cultural changes, obviously, within our country and around the world that we need to, honor. Often the conversations I'll have with clients and companies is, what were the values you grew up with? What is the narrative you learned? Did you learn that leisure is laziness? Did you learn that you have to earn a vacation after you hustle and burn out? Like, what are the narratives you learned in your upbringing in your childhood? And then it's like, oh, and then you go around the room, you start talking to people, and the amount of perfectionism or high expectations beyond their abilities and capacities that they're taking on, the amount of burnout, the amount of shame, those patterns really come to light, which is why I'm really glad I have the therapeutic background and the trauma informed background, as well as now the coaching, because of course when I'm talking to a company or corporation, it's humans with their own traumas. And so often they come to these calls like not really knowing that they could be vulnerable. And then by the end of the call, realizing there's so many truths that are left unsaid. And that's where the change can happen.
And I think, yeah, I mean, for sure. And I think that also, what's important to you said it, like we're dealing, I say this all the time when I'm talking about leadership, right? Like the typical corporate think business way of being is like, one way, right? That's been modeled, and what's expected and how do we act and what's good and what's bad and all of that. And people are managing and leading others in that way, right? And there's, of course, voices that talk about leadership with bringing vulnerability and, being authentic and just all of these different things that are challenging some of those things right now, and have been. That's always been my mission. But I always say you have to remember you're dealing with humans,
Humans.
like it's
Mhm.
people, right? So, and all of the things that come into play that are necessary to make that a really thriving relationship, because it impacts the work, it impacts the team, it impacts the relationships. And relationships are even things like in business, people don't even want to like focus on. Well, that's leadership, that's teamwork, that's all of those things. So it's a little crazy.
Absolutely. The amount of jobs I've had, even with frankly, your neurodivergent and or ADHD specific corporations where they never ask where I live or if I have children or if I have any challenges going on or if I slept well. Like the humanity is not there. And so it really you begin to mask up, you armor up, and then you're not really creatively thinking, you're not living to your full, ability with your out of the box thinking and all the innovation that could take place because you're like filtering through this, what's acceptable, what are the expectations here? What are the judgments and the rejections that I'm going to receive if I, you know, open up more? Mhm.
So, I'd love to understand about when you're coaching, what strategies or techniques do you use to help the people you coach understand their neurological differences? And overall, how does that help then? Obviously, that work helps to create more inclusive and accepting society. That's the goal. But what are the specific strategies you use with those individuals that can help them kind of navigate through that?
Yeah. A lot of it is mindset work, self-acceptance, self-compassion work, but if we know, for instance, that our brain's job is to keep us safe and our brain is braining and we know that our brain feels like the familiar is safe, than if we are, offered a new job or enter a new relationship or take on a new project, and we start to feel imposter syndrome and shame and self-doubt and all these worries that we're not enough, or worries that we're being fake, or worries we'll be found out. And we know that that's our brain braining and sabotaging us to get us back to where it's familiar, even if that means that we're not as successful or not as profitable or not as seen. If that's what our brain does, we're like, okay, brain, like I see you doing that self sabotage thing that you do to keep me at my baseline, to keep me comfortable, because new is not comfortable. It doesn't feel safe. But I'm going to stay the course if that's what I want. I'm going to stay the course anyhow. So it's practicing that, so that we can continue to expand and grow. That's one thing. And then relationally, what I find happens all the time is there's a just a constant power struggle of people who live with those who are neurodivergent, if they happen to be neurotypical, or people with different neurotypes, in the not understanding each other's brains. There's just a whole lot of taking things personally. If one person responds in a certain way when they're offered a task, for example, you're at home and somebody says, could you unload the dishwasher? One person receives that and says, sure, I'll help, no problem. Another person's like, don't tell me what to do, don't take away my freedom, don't take away my autonomy. And like, why is that such a strong reaction? Why is that turning into an argument? Well, that person's coming through a completely different lens of learning and past traumas, and maybe some like persistent drive for autonomy. Or maybe there's a parent child dynamic where they've been parented all their lives by their parents and now parented by their partner, and then they go to maybe work feeling like they've been just like shit on all the time, and then they're not feeling confident. So a little bit of praise goes a long way for someone like that who doesn't receive a lot of praise at home or in childhood. So just knowing and the awareness, and so we kind of pan back, and often I say, let's like look at your life like it's a movie here. Let's witness this, and take some of the emotionality out of it. Take some of the details and the context of our conversations and our arguments, and let's look at the form and the patterns that continue, and where do you keep ending up no matter what you try, and how can we interrupt that? I do that a lot.
Yeah, so and I definitely can see how that, being a therapist, that therapeutic background can help navigate that and help them kind of discover that. And I think what's really interesting about what you said is about, emptying the dishwasher and how people take it differently. Like, think about that, about what all of our interactions, whether that's on a personal level day to day with people we work with, or, in a store or whatever, and even things that happen within our country right now, how people take things differently, right?
Yeah.
And interpret them differently. My God, it was like so clear to me when you said it like that. It's like all these things that are impacting that. And that's why we're seeing things so differently.
Yeah, we all have like a completely different lens. Like there's many different realities going on at the same time, you know? Yeah. Yeah.
That's great work to be able to help somebody work through that and kind of understand it and become the observer almost, to be able to then change that or understand it in a different way and be able to take control of that.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love that. Um, so you mentioned social media before, and I want to ask this question before I move on to just some questions that I have about what companies can do with DE&I work and all of that. But what role do you see social media playing? You mentioned a few things already, but advancing and understanding the acceptance of these identities. And why I'm saying that is, obviously we know the power and the good social media can do. But what comes to mind for me, and I'd love you to comment on, is how do we balance that, and how do we kind of get above the noise that might be on social media that is kind of the other contingent that's kind of pushing away and poo-pooing some of these changing these norms.
Yeah, because one narrative I'm hearing a lot of social media is, what is everybody neurodivergent now? Like all of a sudden, y'all are ADHD and autistic, and yeah, because we're finally learning what it is and what it looks like, and there's finally research, and we're finally hearing from other people in the community, not reading the books only, but in the community, hearing their lived experiences. Like, That resonates. Okay. And I think social media is allowing us to really have the inside look as to what it's like to actually live with a neurodivergent mind and body. And so I think that's very beneficial. And I think the breaking through the stigma is important on social media. And then just the languaging around it. For instance, um, labeling, people like saying, yeah, well, that person's a high functioning autistic. This person low functioning. And I will challenge this till the day I die if I need to. But rather than talking about humans like they're high functioning, low functioning, which implies high value, low value, like our societies are high functioning or low functioning. Our society might be high functioning if it's accommodating all brains and all intersectionalities and marginalized folks. But our society right now is very low functioning. And so I just want to like pull the conversation away from the pathologizing of it. And so, and I see that being a trend in the neurodiversity affirming practices and paradigms. It's not everybody yet, but that's more of the trend. And also challenging the terminology, for example, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There's three words in there that are fairly negative, but especially the two D's being deficit and disorder. If that alone was changed, because I could say I am autistic, which I am, but then I say I have ADHD, um, all of a sudden that pathologizes it. And to say I am disorder and dysfunction doesn't feel right. So there's a dissonance there that I feel like can be changed simply by shifting language. And so I'm hoping that that happens over time. I like neurodivergent because of that. It's like this umbrella term. I don't have to say I am disorder or deficiency. I am neurodivergent. I can fully embrace that. I can say I am neuroqueer. I can fully embrace that. But I don't like saying I am disorder.
Yeah, that's powerful. And I also love that you brought up, because I wanted to ask you about that, about the high and low functioning. Agreed. Like, we're low functioning right now because we're not embracing and kind of understanding at a high level all of these things that impact us, and in the negative impact, and just the lack of, the ignorance about not understanding it, right? About all the things that are not the no.
Norm, exactly. Yeah, and that's when we get into, neuronormativity and heteronormativity, and where did that start? Probably ableism, capitalism, patriarchy. Like, we could just start unraveling it all, which is why transitioning into the corporation conversation, like, corporate America or corporations are still rather stuck in that capitalistic patriarchal place, and ableist place, and probably other things too, that isms and ists. But when I go in to talk about neurodiversity affirming practices and attitudes in the workplace, right away I'm talking about intersectionality. Like, let's look at all the identities, the whole person. I'm not going to get caught up in labeling. And I don't think it's useful to label, oh, this person's this person's that, because then you're seeing them only through that filter. If people only saw me through my neurodivergence or queerness, they'd be missing a whole slew of things that are my lived experience. So I always start with that. And then I do teach them about neuronormativity and heteronormativity and all those forms of oppression. Um, and then I move on to teach about respecting autonomy and presuming competence coming from a strength base. Like, what can we do? What do these folks you work with do well? Not like where do they struggle only? Like, not only what do they need for accommodations that are annoying you because it's costing you more money, but like what are these folks, like what is the benefit and the wonderful assets, that neurodivergent people bring to the companies and organizations. Validating differences, and really celebrating differences. Um, Reframing expectations, like not expecting someone who's neurodivergent to communicate or learn in the same way as somebody else. Offering different assisted technology or learning styles. Offering things like walking treadmill desks and bouncy balls, and having a room where movement is celebrated and accepted, not because it's play, not because we value play and fun only, but because there's a lot of excess energy that people with ADHD in particular have, and autism, and it needs to go somewhere. So it's like, it's necessary. It's not just fun So having a place for movement, um, and then promoting their self advocacy, like offering safe space for them to come and ask for accommodations. And there's some narrative of like, oh great, now everyone's going to want a weighted blanket, everyone's going to want like noise canceling headphones. Well, like maybe, and if everybody does, then that will make for a far more productive, loyal, employer, right? But chances are, because we're all nuanced and different, not everyone's going to need these things, but some people really do. And there are disabilities that need to be honored. So that's usually where I go to start.
Yeah, and I mean, I think those are things that companies in general, if they, I mean, because I think it really comes from, you know, the company's values and the people who own the company and running the company having these values that allow them to open up their thinking, right, and
Yes.
broaden their view and challenge their own bias, because we all need to do that in order to do this work and in order to create that. Because if you subscribe to the norms, that's not going
Exactly.
to happen, right? So,
Exactly. You'll be
right,
close to it all.
right,
You'll
right.
miss
But
all the beauty. Yeah.
yeah, but I think also, to just comment on this before we wrap up, is what's so important about this and the upside, and I've seen it not just in my own life, but in my own, you know, management and leadership and business ownership. There is a, like you said, not the limitation, but the strength, the superpowers that these neurodivergent minds bring that just are not there in the kind of shape shifted model that businesses and companies kind of make people fit into. When people feel liberated and free and are able to be themselves and are able to bring those unique qualities that their different brains, we're all different, allow, it's so amazing what can happen. But it's almost like the environment has to be there for that to
Yes.
occur.
Yeah, just like, we as people at home, like we're not going to want to pick up a paintbrush or do something creative or redecorate our room if we're not feeling safe. Like if like ground up, like we have to feel safe, we have to feel secure, we have to have, financial security to some place, house security to some extent, and then psychological safety too. And nothing creative or innovative is going to happen without that there. So we have to build it up.
Very
Mhm.
true. And as a business owner, like, you want that. You don't want the, okay, let's just do status quo. You want the out of the box thinking. You want that, open that up so that people are able to come with that unique perspective, that, all of those things that happen in that kind of environment and culture. So I love that. I would just want to close with one final question is, because we could talk about this a lot.
I know.
But the neurodiversity is often overlooked, and that's the point of your work in DE&I
Yeah.
initiatives. And so, to bring that into the conversation, just for companies, what's like the first steps besides some of the things that you already mentioned, but just first steps to get started to embrace and bring in the neurodiversity element into their DE&I efforts.
The ERG groups or the separate groups, specifically a neurodiversity group or specifically different neurotype groups, I would say is a really great way to start. And then to support those and allow those employees space and time to utilize those groups. So yeah, yeah. And what they have been doing for me, which I really appreciate in some of these organizations, is funding workshops and webinars and coaching groups for neurodivergent employees where they can actually talk and work through some of these issues. So the companies, the groups themselves, the ERG groups it's not paid time. That's when the employees go in and they connect together. But then the companies are paying for the webinars and paying for the group coaching sessions. And the feedback has been just incredible as to how much safer and more welcome people feel.
That's great. Well, and very hopeful. I love this conversation. I'd love to have you on another episode to dive deeper into this with
Sure.
regard to companies and more things that business owners can do to create that. And really, this is like the tenets of creating the very best culture for mutual, benefit for the employee and for the company. All of this is so important. So thank you for joining me today, Pasha. I had a blast talking with you.
Thank you, Maria, for having me.
And thank you all for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll see you next time on the next episode of Finding the Upside.